everyone. I would like to thank the Employment Department for kindly inviting me to today speak about the green transition and employment. I feel very proud, honored, and happy to be here in this conference, but also in this building, because I was born in Vitoria, and this is my neighborhood, San Martin. I played sports, I've been in the library, so coming back here brings me very good memories. I also feel a bit of pressure because we've had wonderful speakers today. I spoke recently to Sara de la Rica because I invited her to a course on climate change. And she said, I don't know much about this, but I said, you know a lot about fair transition. So now she's invited me to speak about employment. And I don't know much about employment, but I hope I can contribute some ideas today, even though I did bring a PowerPoint. Today I will be speaking about three main ideas, and I would like to highlight this. One of them is a need. Anton Costas mentioned this as the imperative, opportunity, and risks or challenges, or however we want to see it. So I will start with the need, that I believe might be obvious, but I think it's always good to remember this fundamental idea. In a healthy planet, or without a healthy planet, we won't have either in the future or in the present a robust economy, and therefore it will be more difficult to have social justice, equity, and therefore it will be more difficult to have a quality employment. This might seem obvious, but still today, when in the text of the economy school we speak about productivity, the natural capital is still absent in this equation. And nature is what we can develop all our activities from. If this fails, then it will be very difficult. I really liked also what the Vice President Nadia Calviño said when she talked about the artists that have been a measure to maintain something, because when you destroy it, it's much more difficult to go back to the previous situation. And this is exactly what, unfortunately, I have to say we're doing with the planet and nature. When we speak about climate change, here in developed countries, we see it as something that is far away and that really doesn't generate such a big impact as in countries, developing countries, where they are affected daily by the changes in climate. But I brought an example so that you could see this clearly, and that's the example of the Mar Menor. That's something that we've observed recently. You probably all know that in 2019 and in 2021, this area has collapsed. There has been an environmental collapse that had been foreseen. Scientists had warned us, saying that if we continue to pollute the area through the fertilizers in this crop area, the system would collapse, and in fact that's what's happened. When a system collapses, it's not only affects fishing and diversity, but we also destroy employment. Here we can see how many families that worked in the fishing sector had to stop working, and in some cases they lost their jobs. But this is only a direct effect on employment. There are other effects that are not accounted for, but that are also present. For example, this is affecting tourism in the area. People don't go there anymore, and a study of the Bank of Spain recently talked about the loss of assets in the area. So if we don't take care of nature, we will see more and more how this phenomena, like the one of the Mar Menor, are more frequent, and more in number. And climate change is an example. We've had the COP meeting this last few weeks. I guess everyone is aware of what was happening. And the truth is that we still are not on the path of progressing on the Paris Agreement. The promises of the countries on the long term are ambitious, but on the short term, we're not on the right path, which is a concern, because this means that disasters like the one of the Mar Menor can become more frequent. So this is the emergency. We need to stop the ecological crisis. And fortunately, this is so true that we have a green crisis of first magnitude, but also in the ecological transition, in the green transition, and in the energy transition in our country, we can find great opportunities to improve and have an economy with more employment. Why? Someone mentioned this before, and that is the term competitiveness. The green transition is an opportunity for countries that are highly dependent on fossil fuels. We're seeing this now in the energy crisis. We depend of other countries and of prices that have nothing to do with what we can do in our own country. And those countries that have high dependence of fossil fuels and that have renewable resources available, like in the case of Spain and in the Basque country and in general Southern Europe, have a competitive advantage that they can use to improve their economies and increase employment. I believe this is nothing new, that renewable energies in the last 10 years have gone through a revolution in costs. Not only in costs, which is one of the variables. Photovoltaic or solar energy has reduced its cost in an 82% in a decade, the same as a 47% reduction for thermal solar power, and in wind onshore and offshore, they are more competitive as years go by. In this graph here, we can see the evolution of costs in what are called LCOEs that compare different technologies in the same way. What is the cost of a kilowatt per hour in different technologies that have different use periods?
So this graph shows the huge change in renewable energies. Yellow is photovoltaic solar energy and blue is onshore wind energy. Undoubtedly, renewable energies are far more competitive. This week there's a debate around Europe about nuclear energy, new nuclear energy. Building a new nuclear energy plant is 3 times more costly than renewable energy. So this is an important opportunity that we need to make use of. And not just energy transition, it depends on renewable energy, although they're an important part of it. But there are other things as well. For example, in energy efficiency. Here, this is a curve well known in the energy world, which is McKinsey's curve. What McKinsey does is put from left to right the different ways, the different options for reducing emissions, and the breadth of the bar is how many emissions can be actually reduced, and on the horizontal axis the cost per CO2 ton that's been reduced. What's interesting is on the left there's some negative figures. That is, there are many possibilities of saving energy, because of course the energy that's best is the one that you don't use, and give off less CO2. So we need to make the most of that. But it's not just a matter of energy efficiency. We're talking about electrification of the economy with electric vehicles and other kinds of sustainable mobility, or green hydrogen. There are many, many opportunities that can be used if we do things properly. This energy saving that's going to have a repercussion on emissions reduction in the future will create employment, because so resources are freed up from those families who no longer have to spend it on energy and can use that money for other uses and put it to other uses. This is what the majority of international organizations say. This is a diagram that's published by Irina, but the International Monetary Fund and other institutions talk about these medium and long-term employment opportunities in those industries that are highly dependent on fossil fuels, if they can transfer to renewable energies. Of course, there'll be some countries that lose out, but we need to remember that. I'm not going to talk about that, but we need to remember that that will happen. And how are these places going to make this transition? These places that are far more exposed, even if they're not in Europe, and we're not directly affected by them. I'm now going to skip through this a little quicker. We were lucky enough to collaborate with the Ministry for Economic Transition on the impact, the economic impact of the National Plan for Energy and Climate, where the amount of renewables was going to double by 2030, a reduction in energy dependency. We carried out a fairly thorough study which you can find on the ministry's website, and the conclusions that we obtained from that study, one of them was that it was possible to create 350,000 new jobs net if this plan were put into place correctly, and if the investments that the plan required actually came to happen. One of the concerns that existed back then, which was whether we were going to be able to attract these investments, it would seem now with the European funds, there's no doubt that they will appear. And so these employments attached to green employment will happen. This graph includes the main levers for energy transition, the employment that's going to be generated associated to renewables, and in yellow we use a model that allows us to reflect other important effects which are there. According to studies that we carried out in that study, the electricity price using renewable energies would be reduced in comparison to a scenario in which there isn't this additional renewable energy. We looked at how there would be an increase in companies' energy bills and also domestic energy bills. This meant productivity and GDP would go up and employment would be created, as you can see in this graph, and the kind of jobs. We use this econometric model that allows us to break down the jobs into different sectors. So sectors such as that are very, very important, such as the building industry, also would have an increase in their the employment they could offer linked to this energy transition. So we're not talking here about building more buildings, but employment that's related to the refurbishing of these homes. This would probably be also interesting for this subject. On some occasions, workers need to be trained for other skills, but in some it's not just a matter of upskilling them, but rather getting them to do something similar that they used to do, actually instead of building homes, refurbishing them. And there's not so much of a huge difference between both activities. There are also risks attached to this. We can't forget that. These employment opportunities are real. They'll maybe 350 or 300, whatever, it's going to depend. But if we do things properly, these green jobs will appear. But it's important to say that they're not going to be automatic. It depends on good policies. It depends on companies and workers being prepared and on time to make use of these opportunities. There's also risks and challenges that we shouldn't forget. The situation currently is good. I think you already know this, Matt. You've probably already seen this. Our industrial fabric in the Basque country is high in comparison to the surrounding areas, and this is good for us when we talk about this transition, because it's going to be an important industrial component to it. But at the same time, there are also difficulties there. This graph from the European Commission shows on the left those sectors that are considered in decline. Here we're okay, in the sense that the majority of the sectors in decline are in coal mining. This transition has already been gone through in the Basque country many years ago, in other areas of Spain more recently. So basically this is solved. But what we don't have solved are those sectors that are intensive in fossil fuel use, and the automobile sector that also needs to change. And in there, on the right-hand graph, you can see how the amount of employment related to these sectors is greater than the European average. So we need to change our employment structure. We need to be a step ahead of this. We need to be leaders in decarbonisation, because if we do lead these policies, then we'll be able to have a better transition than if we don't, than if we resist change, as it were. And finally, I wanted to finish my talk by mentioning a risk that is just floating in the air, especially with what Anton Costas said recently, and which is the social discontent. And when you talk about energy crisis, you know that fossil fuel prices need to go up. We need them to go up if we're going to move to an energy transition, but this needs to be done within this context of social justice and reduction of inequalities, because otherwise people aren't going to go with us in this energy transition. Otherwise, you need new fair transition policies alongside these decarbonation and electrification policies. This graph is just the summary of analysis that we did a few years ago about the impact on different kinds of homes. We've got, in this case, the percentile of which, in this case, it's with a tax on CO2 emissions. And here you can see that it has a great effect on low-income families. But then what we asked ourselves was, what would happen if we followed a carbon fee and dividend policy in which the money that was collected from this tax was shared out or transferred amongst homes? If you do that, then the progressiveness of this measure changes completely. You don't have to accept that green policies have to be expensive. It depends on how we design them and how we add other compensatory policies to them, so that they can also not just be green, but also progressive. So I'm going to conclude saying that this green transition is necessary. It's going to bring many opportunities if we know how to make use of them, and the risks are out there, but we're going to have to face those risks and minimize them. Another idea that I also feel is important of the transition is that transition needs to be green, but also needs to be social. I think both Mr. Costas and other speakers have spoken about this striking balance between efficiency and fairness. You can't choose between one of them. And people say that you do need to choose, but no, actually it's not. What we need to do is to progress fairly so that the economy can prosper and grow. And I think there's a message here to get across. Either we progress with social justice, or I personally don't think we're going to be able to solve the climate change problem in the time that we need to. If we don't get everybody on board, if the whole population doesn't realise that this energy transition is going to help them, if it's not fair, I don't think we'll be able to do it. So we actually put more at stake in the social part of this energy transition than the technological side of it. And with that, I will finish. Thank you.